Managing Project Resources is Unit 10, which is part of the SCQF Level 8 Diploma in Project Management awarded by EAL. In this video I'm going to go through the unit and explain how to gather evidence for this unit. In the unit description it explains that resource management comprises of the acquisition and deployment of the internal and external resources required to deliver the project, programme or portfolio. Resources is quite a broad term for this unit, and it's deliberately so that you can gather evidence for whatever project that you're working on. Lots of different people will complete this SVQ and they'll be working in a wide range of different industries. So resources can be anything consumable, reusable, it can be equipment, it can be materials, and it can be people with skills. It can be anything really that is required to actually put your project together. This unit sits at SCQF Level 8 and there's 14 credits for completing this unit. This unit has 4 outcomes. The first outcome is specific to the project planning stage of the project life cycle, and it is being able to develop resource management plans for project activities. So that is essentially planning out your resource management plan. Outcome 2 onwards is specific to the project delivery phases. Outcome 2 is being able to acquire and manage resources. Outcome 3 is being able to monitor progress and identify departures for the resource plan and for project activities. And outcome 4 is reflective on you evaluating your resource management process and draw lessons for future projects. So let's start with outcome 1, which is putting together a resource plan for your project, or at least contributing towards it. 1.1 is analyse the project management plan to identify the type, quality and quantity of resources required and confirm how they will meet project requirements. First step in putting together your resource plan is to identify what it is that you need, what the quality or what the standard of it is, and how many that you need. And you should confirm with stakeholders or with the plans that have already been created that these requirements, these resources will meet the requirements for your project. So for this, reflect on your experience where you've developed a resource plan. What resources did you plan for? How did you identify the type, quality and quantity of resources required? Who did you communicate this with, and how did you analyse these resources would meet the project requirements? Product evidence for this could be a resource management plan with detail on resources. It could be a work breakdown structure or an organisational breakdown structure. It could also be a responsibility assignment matrix. 1.2 is produce specifications and estimates for resources justifying the estimates. The first criteria, you've identified what you need. The second one is about identifying what standard it's got to be at and to go and get estimates about the quantity and about the price. And you want to justify the method that you're using for estimating how much you require. So there's different estimating techniques. One example would be PERT. Another example would be looking at previous projects and estimating based on that, maybe making some adjustments if your project's bigger or smaller. That's another technique. So using a technique such as that, you want to evidence that you're able to create estimates for how much resources you will require and the specification that they must meet. So reflect on your experience developing a resource plan. How did you produce the estimates for resources? What techniques did you use? How did you document it? What were the estimates and what was the specification? How did you determine that specification and how did you document it? Product evidence would be your resource histogram, work breakdown structure, responsibility assignment matrix, or any sort of cost estimates for resources. 1.3, assess the availability of resources, include contingencies in the resource plan. Likely there's going to be some changes, some difficulties, some wastage as the project develops, and because of that it's important to include some contingencies, so that is extra resources in case these issues do arise. So using an appropriate method for your project, you want to be able to evidence that you have been able to calculate how much contingency is required and that you've included that as part of your resource plan. So reflect on your experience where you've developed a resource management plan. How did you assess your sources for resources? What risks could happen to the supply and what contingencies did you identify and record should there not be the availability of your planned resources? So that is perhaps substituting equipment or materials for something else if there's none available. And how did you document and include this in your resource management plan? Part of this could be looking at alternative suppliers. Product evidence would be your project versus business as usual analysis. Could be project context, both micro and macro. Could be a pestle analysis, could be looking at previous projects, and some form of documentation about your techniques for estimating how much contingency you might require, or communication around that. 1.4. Investigate factors that will influence the acquisition of resources and make recommendations on how to acquire and manage goods and services. For this, you want to evidence that you've been able to identify what could go wrong when you're acquiring resources and what is required to manage the process of acquiring those resources. That could be due to with project processes, having set templates, having set flowcharts about what steps need to be done to acquire the resources, to approve them, and what processes are there in place to manage the goods once they've actually been acquired, where are they going to be stored, and what's the process for monitoring how many there is, do more need to be reordered, and keeping track of all of that. So reflect on your experience where you've had to develop a resource management plan. How did you investigate factors which will influence the acquisition of resources? What factors are there, and how would that impact on the acquisition of resources? What recommendations did you therefore put forward to acquire and manage goods and services, and how did you record and document this? Product evidence would be a project management plan or a resource management plan with detail, a report or plan on procurement, perhaps procurement strategy. So this ties in a little bit into procurement, and there is a little bit overlap here with this particular unit and with the contracts unit and potentially the finance unit as well if you have selected those optional units. 1.5. Determine timescales for the delivery of resources in parallel with other planning processes, balancing project requirements with business as usual demands, including scope and schedule management. There's a link here between schedule and resources. Typically the schedule, it should be, particularly at the planning stage, created first, so you know when you need things, and then from that you can then create your estimates and work out when you need them. So 1.5 is all about you evidencing that you have analysed when you need the resource and you've tied that into your schedule plan. So reflect on your experience when you have developed the resource management plan. How did you determine the timescales for the delivery of resources? How did this affect other management plans? How did you do this while considering the implications for scope management? And how did you do this while considering the implications for schedule management? What impact on resource delivery schedule did scope and schedule management have? So keep into consideration, there's the scope, so there's the defined boundaries for your project in terms of time, cost, quality, and you've also got your schedule, so that's when activities are required. So for activity to be completed, you'll need the required resources in place, and so that should be taken into consideration when you're determining your timescales for delivery. Product evidence for this would be to reference your scope and schedule management plans to show that's been taken into consideration. Perhaps there's some planning documentation on delivery timescales, and there might also be some communication around arranging this. 1.6. Obtain approval for the mobilisation of resources to meet the project needs, ensuring that demobilisation on completion of work is built into the plan. So this is you now looking to mobilise and to acquire the resources. So there's a bit of an overlap between this criteria and outcome 2. You could also take it though in the planning stage where you're designing the approval process. What has to be done for resources to be acquired? How has that been planned out for your project, and what have you done to contribute towards that? Key part of this is to ensure that once the project's completed, or once that activity is completed, you no longer need that resource, that equipment, or those people. There is a plan on what to do with them once the project's finished using them. So there's demobilisation upon completion of work is built into the plan, so ensure you can evidence that as well. For this, reflect on your experience when you've developed a resource management plan. What was the process for obtaining approval for the mobilisation of resources? How did you include this as part of your plan? How did you use this procedure, and did you actually go about using it? Did you acquire and mobilise resources? And what's the procedure for demobilising resources once they've been used? And how did you include that as part of your resource management plan? Product evidence for this could be procurement documentation completed in accordance with your project management plan and organisational or project procedures. Documentation may be attached to an email. It could be planning documents about if your example or if your situation is planning the process, it could be the planning documentation. 1.7. Determine the resource management infrastructure and agree with stakeholders in parallel with other planning processes, including scope, schedule and quality management. Resource management infrastructure is anything that you need to manage the acquisition and the movement of resources on site. So this could be transportation, logistics, warehousing, storage, anything to do with transferring. Might require people with certain skills to be trained if it's people, if that's your resource. So it's about managing that infrastructure that's required to support resources, and that should be done with your stakeholders that need to use this equipment and with other planning processes, so it's on schedule, it's to the right standard, it's also within the scope of the project, so you're not going too far and resulting in scope creep. So for this, reflect on your experience. We have had to agree the resource management infrastructure. How did you plan the resource management infrastructure? What stakeholders did you have to agree the plan with? And how did you do this in parallel with other planning processes, including scope, schedule and quality management? Product evidence could be a work breakdown structure, organisational breakdown structure or RACI. Could be your resource management plan with detail, or an email agreeing responsibilities with stakeholders, or having this arranged and put into place. Moving on now to the second outcome and transitioning into the project delivery phase. This outcome is about acquiring resources, and the first criteria, 2.1, is assess the requirement for resources and any potential competing demands in order to determine the type of agreement to be established, including service level agreements in terms of reference. So this is you assessing and identifying that resources are required. How do you confirm that resources are required? Do you communicate with stakeholders, or is there a set process that requires so many goods or so many items of resource to be acquired according to a service level agreement? Service level agreement is an agreement for certain services to be provided within a set time scale, and that will depend on the individual agreement. For this, reflect on your experience. You've had to acquire and manage resources. How did you assess and identify which resources are required, the quantity of them and the standard? What were the resources, the quantity and the standard required? What type of agreement was required and what was the service level agreement? And how is this all documented? Product evidence might be a resource management plan detailing the specific requirements and the procurement agreement required, or it could be a resource management plan detailing the service level agreements for procurement of resources, any documentation at all around you identifying that there are actually resources required for your project. 2.2, negotiate the acquisition of resources and maintain records of any problems, resolving difficulties as they arise. There's a link here between this criteria and a criteria in the communications, an outcome in the communications unit, which is about negotiation. So if you are engaged in negotiations around acquiring resources, then holistic evidence would be able to be mapped into that outcome in the communications unit too. So it might be worthwhile looking into that one. Negotiate is quite straightforward. You are contacting suppliers. It could also be internally where you're contacting other stakeholders within the organisation to negotiate machinery, equipment or resources being made available for your project. For this, reflect on your experience. We've had to negotiate the acquisition of resources. Who are you negotiating with? What were you negotiating about? What was your negotiation strategy? How did you maintain records of any problems or difficulties when they arise? Product evidence for this could be communication negotiating with internal or external stakeholders. It could also be documents of resources required, your negotiation strategy or fallback positions. A lot more detail can be found looking at the outcome in the communications unit. 3.2, liaise with resource owners to ensure that resources are delivered to meet timescales and in compliance with service level agreements or terms of reference. Or generally speaking, it could be in compliance with the schedule as well for your project. So this one's about communication. Liaison means communication with resource owners. So that is the people who either own the resource within your project, or it could be, if you're acquiring resources internally, it could be other stakeholders who would normally own the resource and you're acquiring it from them. But for most people in most projects, this is going to be the people who actually need the resources to complete the activities that they're responsible for. And so you're communicating with them to ensure that the resources are delivered on time, the right standard, the right numbers being delivered that's been outlined in the service level agreement. So for this one, reflect on your experience. We've had to acquire and manage resources, and how did you communicate with stakeholders to ensure that resources have been delivered according to the agreement or the service level agreement? What changes, adjustments and updates did you have to make to deliver resources, if any, and how did you do this? Were the resources delivered in compliance with the agreements? Product evidence for this would be communication, where you are liaising or communicating with your stakeholders. That could be an email, could be instant messages and collaborative technology, uploading documents to shared files, could be letters or any other form of communication. and that should be with resource owners confirming that resources have been delivered in accordance with the service level agreement. Now moving on to the third outcome, which is about monitoring your resources as your project goes on. So 3.1, establish and implement appropriate reporting procedures to monitor progress against the resource management plans. So for this, you're monitoring that resources are being used at the correct level, that perhaps it could be an issue if there's too many resources being used, and equally it could be an issue if there's not enough resources being used. If there's not enough resources being used, that could mean that your project is behind, so you maybe want to look at the schedule, or it could mean that the project has been delivered to lower quality or a lower standard if resources haven't used appropriately. For this, reflect on your experience where you've had to monitor progress and identify departures from the resource plan. What was the reporting procedures for the resource management plan? How did you contribute towards its design? How does it connect with the resource management plan, and how is it implemented? Who's responsible? So a bit of detail around you coming up and planning the monitoring programme for monitoring resources. Product evidence would be any documentation around this, which might include reporting, earned value management, or evidence of sharing updates and reports to relevant stakeholders. 3.2, identify and record issues and departures from the resource management plan and establish the likely consequences for the project. The last criteria there was you planning how you're going to monitor resources. 3.2 is you're now monitoring them and you've identified and recorded an issue or a departure from that resource plan. And also you've been able to then identify what the consequences are, what is the impact on your project of that deviation from the resource management plan. For this, reflect on your experience where you've had to monitor progress and identify departures from the resource plan. What issues were identified, how were they identified, and how did you record them? What was the impact of this departure in the project? What action did you take to minimise the consequences? Product evidence could be reporting on resourcing issues and departures, could also be email communication regarding identified departures from plan. 3.3, recommend and justify corrective actions for departures from the resource management plan. So you've identified them, you've worked out what the consequences are for the project, now you've got to come up with a solution to that departure. What action could be taken to correct the resource issue and get back on track regarding the resource plan? That is going to be very specific to your project. So reflect on your experience. You've had to monitor and identify departures from the resource plan. What was the deviation? Was there contingency plans already in place? And if so, how did you activate and follow those contingency plans? If there wasn't a contingency plan in place, how did you come up with the solution? Did you communicate with stakeholders? Did you look at lessons learned? How did you find out what would be the best way to go forward? What recommendation did you make? And how did you communicate this recommendation with, or how did you communicate that? And what action did you take? Product evidence would be any documentation around this, which might include a report of any corrective actions taken, or an email dealing and justifying with the corrective action that you've taken. The next outcome is make revisions to the resource management plan in association with stakeholders and in compliance with the formal change management process. There's a link here with an outcome in the scope management unit, which is about complying with the formal change management process. So if you have done this, I'd highly recommend looking at the scope management unit and writing or gathering holistic evidence, which would also cover that outcome as well. And that goes into more detail about this, about individual specific more detailed steps on the change management process, which ideally you're covering with this anyway. This one, you've worked out what the change is going to be, you know what action is going to be taken, and now you need to make revisions to documentation to reflect that. So reflect on your experience where you have managed change to the resource management plan. How was the change requested? Who requested change? How did it come about? If this was in reaction to a deviation, might be yourself or your team that's making that change. What was the change? What documents had to be updated? How did you document it? What's the version control? Where did you save it to? All the detail around updating that documentation. And then how did you communicate that out? That's the sort of next point. Product evidence would be change management in action, version control of the documents updated, or updated versions of those documents. 4.1, moving on to the fourth outcome. This is reflective on your experience in managing resources, and this is evaluate alternative methods to those used within the project for developing the resource management plan, acquiring and managing resources, controlling changes and monitoring progress, which include a choice of metrics. So for this, reflect on your experience managing project resources. for each of the listed areas, what were the techniques which you've used in your project, what worked well for each technique, and what could have worked better. Are there other techniques which you could have used? It's important you cover each of these list items. There's two ways to do it. You can either do it as an individual piece of evidence, where you're looking at all items on this list, or you can include it as part of holistic evidence, where you are writing or gathering holistic evidence on acquiring and managing resources, and during that you're evaluating alternative methods. If you're doing it that way though, each item on the list has to be covered by holistic statements. You have to cover each item on the list to close off the criteria as a whole. Product evidence would be a review document or a reflective account. Thanks for listening, and hopefully that helps you gather evidence for the resource management unit.